welcome at least, and I shall share the screen. Okay, thanks again. This is take two, and thanks to Ermolaos for jumping in. I'd say Ermolaos got a bit of a fright there as well. So I'm going to start as if I never said a word before, and thank safefood, Linda and Tracy for getting this off the ground, and hopefully this will work this time. So I've been working with FSAI, Food Safety Authority of Ireland, for since 2000. So I've been working on novel foods since 2000, basically. And things have changed a lot. What we now call food innovation would include new foods and beverages. And it's always been part of the food industry as such. It would have been a very boring existence if we had nothing new coming on the market. And of course, some of them are commercially successful and some of them are not. And that is entirely up to the market as such. I suppose in terms of innovation, it doesn't just involve new foods and beverages, it also involves new ways of doing things and developing ways, for example, to reduce waste, be more considerate of the environment, and sustainability and the circular economy would be central themes in that effect. Food waste, food packaging, food miles, they're all just examples of where we're trying to improve the production of food. Indeed, from the regulators' perspective, we're also trying to improve the way we work along with our frontline agencies to be more effective, efficient, and I suppose work with the food businesses as such. So in terms of novel food and novel food regulation, EU food law in general is focused on protecting consumer safety and interests, but it's also about ensuring the integrity of the internal market. And to that end, it tries to ensure that all 27 member states now operate under the same set of rules. The legislation included here represents the most innovative of regulated food categories. There might be others that I'm missing, but these are the ones that I'd be more familiar with in terms of innovation. The novel food regulation is pretty much a catch-all. It applies to all foods if they're not captured by, let's say, under food enzymes or food additives or flavorings, etc. In a few cases, there is some duplication. For example, if you want to put a new food supplement on the market, if it's a new ingredient, then it would have to go through the novel food regulation first and then be authorized as a supplement. But as EU food law evolves, to be fair, you can see examples of it. They're trying to get rid of such duplication as such. So in terms of novel food, what is a novel food? So it's a food or ingredient not consumed in the EU to a significant degree prior to May 15th, 1997. There's nothing specifically interesting about May 15th, 1997. That's just when the legislation came into force. It originally came in with GMOs as part of it. They were removed in 2003 to separate legislation. The May 15th, 1997 does cause a bit of a problem because the further on we go from that, then it's more difficult to show that, for example, through receipts or something like that, that a product had a history of consumption to a significant degree on the EU market. Even significant degree is rather subjective and does cause some hassle the odd time. It also talks about a novel process. So it's a process that wasn't used before 1997 and that alters the composition, the nutritional value, or the level of undesirable substances. So that could be considered a novel process, and the food resulting from that process would have to be authorized. And I'll give an example of that later. For a novel food, if it is deemed a novel food, then it has to be assessed and authorized before it can go on the market. Now, this is an example where where the UK has diverged somewhat at the moment, particularly in the cases of the hemp products, CBD oils, etc. They're allowing those to stay on the market until they authorize them in the UK. In the EU, an unauthorized novel food cannot be on the market. We have a thing called the Novel Food Catalogue. It's an informal, non-legally binding record of discussions at EU level about the novel food status of certain products. And this came about in probably, I think, 2002, we put it together first, simply because we were getting questions, and then a couple of years later, we would get similar or the same questions. And depending on the personnel changes, etc., a different answer could actually go out. So we decided to put these all down in writing. The answers in the novel food catalogue can be changed. So if in the novel food catalogue something is deemed a novel food, if some entity comes up with evidence of a history of consumption before 97, then that entry can be changed to not novel. The new regulation, as we still call it, came into effect on January the 1st, 2018. And my experience of it, and I think others would agree that it's a lot more effective, and I'll go through the reasons why. But if you look at the old regulation between 1997 and 2018, there was approximately 200 applications went through that. With the new legislation in place only in a short number of years, already that's surpassed 200. The website on the top right-hand side of that slide is a very useful website. It's the European Commission's website on novel food. And if there's anything in there you need on novel food, it's going to be in there. It's quite an extensive and well updated website. So in the original novel food legislation, which came in literally in the last century, applications were processed and assessed by member states, a member state. So the idea was, and I think this was set out in the legislation, you applied to the member state in which you first intended to place on the market. That never really worked. Applicants would go and see who was available, who would answer the phones, who was cost less, etc. Because there was a cost to applicants for a member state to assess these applications. If there was a reasoned objection by a member state or member states, then the initial assessment by the original member state was sent on to originally the Scientific Committee for Food, which later became EFSA in 2002 when they were set up. And this, of course, would delay the process. EFSA had done a lot of this work before 2018, so they were well aware of how the operation worked. In the old legislation, authorizations applied only to the applicant. So if Pat O'Mahony applied to the European Union for an authorization for a novel food, if that was granted, it was granted to Pat O'Mahony only. Now, the way to get around a complete jam up of the system, if others wanted to put the same food on the market, in the legislation, it allowed for substantial equivalence opinions to be provided by member states. So these were opinions granted or given, shall we say, by individual member states without need for consultation with other member states or the Commission or EFSA. And they did cause some problems because you had, in those days, 28 different member states, and they had their own way of doing it. But it did stop the system from jamming up. So, for example, when I talk about plant sterol containing foods later, there was only there was a few applications, but the vast majority of the products on the market came through substantial equivalence opinions. Another good reason for the substantial equivalence opinion was if a company had a product that was very similar to an existing food, then the member state that they approached would make a decision whether that fell within the scope of novel food or not. Substantial equivalence opinions are gone now, so it's a different situation. In those days, if you were unsure of the novel food status of your product, you went and asked the competent authorities in a member state or several member states. And if it went all the ways, it would go to the standing committee, but there was very few of these actually decided at standing committee level. It was ineffective, to be honest. We would often have brought questions to the working group and we never really got answers back. So that wasn't a good process. And then, of course, there was only 4 novel food categories. The 2 GM food categories were removed in 2003 when the GM food legislation came along. So that was the old legislation. It did its job. It was okay for its time, but it was superseded then by the 2015 2283 regulation. So in this case, applications are processed by the Commission. There's a central online site where you submit your applications to the Commission. And I think this is a good time to convey the message that the Commission are very effective in what they do. They get a lot of applications and yet they process them in a timely fashion. And then once the Commission are happy that all the information is in an application, if it's necessary, the application is sent on to EFSA. Now, in some cases, an application might be to extend the uses to a different category or change specifications. So something that wouldn't necessarily affect the safety, shall we say, and therefore EFSA wouldn't necessarily be contacted to do an assessment. So in general, the application is processed, received, processed, and sent on to EFSA by the Commission. And there is no cost to the applicant. So that's for a start. The benefits there are consistency and reliability. So the Commission are very consistent and efficient in how they operate. And EFSA, of course, has a stream of scientists. And so the assessments by EFSA are central and consistent and reliable as well, which differs from the old system where you had different member states with different views on matters. The authorizations under the new regulation, or shall I say the current regulation, are generic. So that means if Mahoney gets a novel food authorized, it's authorized for everybody. Once the food going on the market meets this criterion and the specifications listed in the union list. There are exceptions, of course, and the reason for the exception is that you can't have somebody spending a whole lot of money and time and resources getting a product through the authorization system, and then everybody can jump on the bandwagon as such. So how it works is that if the applicants can demonstrate to the Commission that some of the data they had used that was critical for the safety assessment was proprietary, let's say toxicology or nutritional value, etc., then they're granted a 5-year exemption, whereby that authorization is for the applicant only. Now, that doesn't stop other applicants from submitting their own applications with their own data, but it does give that applicant some way of, I suppose, getting their money back, if you like, for spending all that money on the original application. There are no substantial equivalence opinions. That is negated, I suppose, by the generic authorizations. Article 4 is now a formal means of determining the novel food status of by a member state. So a member state will receive an application from an applicant to determine the novel food status. They can consult with other member states or not, depending on the situation. There is a new option for traditional foods from a third country, and this was brought about by by complaints under the old system by non-EU countries, where they claimed that foods that were on their market for generations were still subject to safety assessments and this clumsy authorization process. So there is a new process now where if a country outside of Europe submits an application, it's viewed first by member states and the Commission and EFSA, and then it goes through a different system. There's now 10 novel food categories, not 4. And even I'd say if it was to be reviewed in a number of years, there could be 15 or 20 novel food categories. We have a union list of novel foods, and this tends to be the way the Commission are going with these, and it's much more effective and easy to look to see is a food novel or is it not, because you'll whether it's authorized or not. And then of course we have Article 6.2, which says that only authorized novel foods can be on the EU market. And that's where we have a bit of diversity with the UK at the moment. So the regulations are here. I won't go into those. They're all again on the Commission website, so you're free to go and access that. So you have the main regulation 2015-2283, and then 4 other Commission implementing regulations which facilitate the operation of it, basically. In terms of the authorization process itself, don't get too frightened by this. It starts with the applicant submitting a dossier to the Commission, and this is all done centrally, electronically, on the Commission website. The Commission will validate that apparently without delay, but it should be done within a month. Having said that, the Commission may go back and forth to an applicant to get further information or maybe to change information. And then if required, which is the case in most situations, the Commission will send that dossier onto EFSA for safety assessment, and Ermolaos has given you some good examples there of the work they do. And again, you can't underestimate the consistency of this work by the Commission and EFSA, whereas before applicants would have been floundering between member states trying to figure out who can do the best job for them. EFSA has 9 months to issue their opinion, but then if there is further information required, the clock will stop as such. The EFSA opinion is issued, and then the Commission will draft an opinion. And if it's a favorable EFSA opinion, the Commission will draft an authorization regulation as such, which is then discussed at the Novel Food Working Group. And this is where most of the initial trashing out of technical and other details is carried out. I suppose it can't be understated the ingenuity of the Commission here to get all member states on side, because all member states will have their own experts who have their own opinions, etc. But in the end of the day, more often than not, the Commission proposal gets qualified majority at standing committee. Every now and then there is a rejection of a dossier, but it's usually by qualified majority as well. There is an appeals committee, but that is never used in novel foods. It's always used for GM foods, for example. So I think the success of EFSA and the Commission here in getting this process through is exemplary, to be honest. Now, in the case of traditional foods from third countries, it's somewhat similar. The applicant sends in the dossier to the Commission gives it to member states and EFSA for their view. If there are reasoned objections and the Commission agrees with them, then the applicant is approached and given the option basically to either withdraw the application or send it through the normal application process. I might just mention in that last slide that when it comes to vote at the standing committee in Ireland, FSAI doesn't have the vote. That's a policy matter. So we advise the Department of Health and they take the vote. So that's just a clarification. In terms of the union list, when you go to the Commission website and go on there just to see what's on there or to find whether a food is novel or not, you'll see two tables in the annex. Table 1 is a list of the name of the authorized novel food, the conditions of use, labeling or other requirements, and then table 2 is the specification. So if a product is authorized, anybody can put that food on the market as long as it's within the authorized uses and the specifications as such. And this is just a clarification, and I get clarification from the Commission. If you do go on and look at the union list on the Commission website, you might be a bit confused in that the original novel foods that came from the old system are nicely tabulated, and all the others are in updated Commission implementing regulations. Now, ideally, they'd all be in the tabulated form, but the Commission, being fairly well stretched with the number of applications they get, haven't got around to putting all these into the tabulated form yet, so they will eventually. And just looking at trends and fads, I know Ermolaos has gone through some of those as well. For example, back in 2002, plant sterols, I think Unilever put this in a plant sterol spread. That is still on the market. It's still doing well, as are the many other products that have added plant sterols and stanols. So you could call that a trend rather than a fad. The one right beside it here is called Noni juice. That came on the market and was authorized around the same time. It did come, unfortunately, with a whole heap of health claims, shall we say. This is before the nutrition and health claims legislation came along in 2006. They wouldn't be allowed now. You can still find these online. The product itself, I don't think, is on the market in Europe. It's still authorized as such, and so they're allowed to sell it. They wouldn't be allowed to make these fairly outlandish claims that you see there in front of you. And then, of course, another product that came on the market in 2009. It's not a fad. It's still on the market. It's still very popular. And so we have trends and fads. I thought I'd pick out a few examples of interesting products that have come on the market over the years. This one came in 2009. The UK did the assessment. It's called ice structuring protein, and the idea was rather good. It was a reduced fat ice cream. You couldn't lose on this one. It brought a few new things into play. First of all, there was some arguments in the Novel Food Working Group whether it was an additive or an ingredient. For those of you who don't know, an additive is not an ingredient. It's something that has a technological I suppose, characteristic in the food. And in this case, this protein kept the cream together, or the ices together, rather than the high levels of cream. It also was one of the first times that a protein was produced by a GM yeast or a GM microorganism as such, but fell outside of the scope of the GM food legislation. So it was interesting from a few perspectives in that case. The other one that was interesting at the time, and if some of you are old enough to remember going along the streets and seeing chewing gum stuck to the ground or under tables, it was because of the rubbery substance that was the basis for chewing gum at that stage. These two new products came on the market around the same time, 2011, 2012, and they're basically new polymers for chewing gum. I'm not sure whether they're on the market or not, but I would presume they are because I don't see that much chewing gum stuck to the ground anymore. So there have been some innovative products that have come on the market over the years. In terms of stanols and stenols, or sterols, I think they would be considered the first trend we would have seen because when the first products were authorized, there was tens, if not hundreds, of substantial equivalence opinions that came through. So I think that would be the first trend. We still see trends, but now whether that continues or not. Another trend we would have seen over the years is these healthy oils from either animals or plants or fish. They're products that you wouldn't necessarily see you'd see them in the ingredients list, but they don't strike you as being totally out there as such. More recently, we have, I suppose, with the environmental concerns from animal production, we have plant-based meats. They're the focus of some attention recently with apparent benefits for the environment and climate change. However, the commercial success or otherwise of these products is not guaranteed as such. On the right-hand side, you'll see the bane of our lives in a lot of cases, hemp-based products like CBD oils and edibles, etc. They're novel foods for the most part. They're also subject to other legislation, for example, medicinal legislation, narcotic drugs rules, and EFSA are assessing the safety of a number of these products at the moment. It's difficult to know whether they will remain on the market as foods or whether they'll be subsumed under medicines legislation. It's just difficult to know. Ermolaos has already mentioned in detail about insects, so I don't think I'll go into these. The success or otherwise of these on the market, I suppose, depends on the market you're talking about, is questionable at the moment. What was notable about these in the last year or so, we were forewarned by the Commission about, I suppose, a concerted campaign of emails and social media alerts that governments across Europe were force-feeding consumer insects and insect products, which of course is not the case. They have to be labeled as such. But it's just interesting how these things pick up. Ermolaos has already mentioned cell and animal tissue culture, so I won't go into detail, but it is notable that 3 extracts from plant cell cultures got on the market in 2008, 9, and 15 through substantial equivalence opinions from Italy. Now, these are extracts, so they probably were looking at antioxidants or whatever in those. But it's a contrast to what's going on at the moment in terms of animal cell cultures. And again, Ermolaos has given you details on what EFSA has been doing. The OECD, the FAO, WHO, they've all been working on these products. A cultured chicken is on the market in Singapore since 2020, and just recently the US gave the go-ahead for 2 cell cultured chicken products. So these are coming at us and likely to be on the market in many markets in years to come. However, I did read a journal, I suppose an industry journal recently, and the complaint was that European regulators were holding up innovation, which I found interesting because to my knowledge, there hasn't been any application or even queries about getting these products on the European market. But I think even if we're listening to Ermolaos there, I think we're ready for that if and probably when it comes. And of course, there are narratives out there. Some will say that these are going to save the planet in terms of environment, but then I saw recently a peer-reviewed publication out of California that said that was all bluster, that there was no, I suppose, environmental benefits to these cultured meats, because the actual propagation of those in large culture vats is fairly intensive in terms of energy, etc. So who knows? We'll have to see the safety assessment from our side, and then after that, the markets will look out for those products. In terms of novel processes, so a process is novel only if it alters the composition, the nutritional value, or level of undesirable. So a good example here, and FSCI dealt with this from an Irish company in 2016-17. So basically, mushrooms grown in the dark don't have any vitamin D in them, but when you give them a light pulse or a UV light pulse, all of a sudden they get appreciable amounts of vitamin D. So the reason these mushrooms were then deemed novel was because you had vitamin D, a nutrient, going from 0 up to appreciable levels. This one went through the old novel food process fairly clear. The company worked with us and we got a decent dossier in, and there were no objections at the time. Contrast that to high pressure processing, which was authorized in 2002. When we sat down after that process, I think all member states kind of agreed that there was no real need at the start to do that novel food application because there was no change other than the level of microbes was reduced as such. Having said all that, there's a number of other processes out there that we know the industry are using, but nobody's ever asked the question, are they novel or are they not? So that's probably a job of work that's coming down the track at us. And to finish up, Ermolaos again mentioned nanotechnology way back in 2005-06. It was all the rage on the industry journals that nanotechnology was going to do this, that, and the other, not just in packaging, but in foods. And of course, even at that stage, a lot of medical, recreation products, cosmetics, fuel technology, industrial goods, all were using nanotechnology and very effectively, and still do. But when it was starting to be applied to the food side of things, I suppose when EFSA and other member states started to look at the safety levels, then it was, a problem, and nobody had really looked at the safety, the persistence of these nanomaterials in the environment. So a nanomaterial basically is something, it's an organic product, usually man-made, but not necessarily. Between 100 and 1 nanometers, that's very small. Those type of products can get into cellular areas like the nucleus, nucleolus, mitochondria, etc., where their larger counterparts don't. On top of that, they're more physically and chemically reactive. So you have these molecules that can go places that their large counterparts can't go, and they're more reactive. So that was a problem. And of course, at the moment, titanium dioxide is the first additive that's been on the market for many years. That's been removed. Basically, I think because of the lack of safety being established. I don't think they've identified any serious safety risks. Ermolaos can correct me there if I'm wrong. And then others in the same vein are being looked at: silicon dioxide, silver, gold, etc. All authorized additives. And the problem is when they were initially assessed, safety assessed, their larger counterparts were assessed. And I'm going to finish off with 2 simple slides, I suppose. Basically, sometimes when we're asked questions at the Novel Food Working Group or member states individually, they're a bit bizarre. So I'm not sure, has anybody ever come across backflower essences, etc.? They seem to be a homeopathic cure, if we call it that. The question posed to a member state was, are these novel foods? So the question sent back was, right, what's in them? When the answer came back, there are certain flowers, they're novel foods. But then the companies would say, but what happens is the extracts or the essences of the flowers are added to water and they're diluted so much that there is none left. So they can't be novel foods. The answer back then was, you have the labeling legislation which says you can't mislead the consumer. So if they're not novel foods, it's a misleading label. If they are novel foods, they have to be authorized. And one more question, I suppose there's 2 in here really. A couple of years ago, we had a query about a hospital in Ireland who was importing breast milk from the US. Now, I suppose breastfeeding mothers needn't be worried. When a product is on the market since before 1997, it's not a novel food. So obviously, people have been breastfeeding their children for millennia as such. But when it becomes a commercial product, it becomes a food, and you have a food business doing it. That's where we were concerned about the quality and whatnot of the product coming in. Now, we did bring this to our colleagues in Brussels, and it was a difficult question, and there was no answer because I suppose people were worried about bringing breast milk and breastfeeding down a certain road. Anyway, we dropped that for now because it was a kind of a once-off as far as I know. It was for preterm children. But a similar question some years ago was about human placenta. Some people get human placenta once a child is born, and they get it put into pellets and they consume it for their own benefits. Is that, or is that a novel food? That was another question we brought to Europe. And again, we didn't get the answer. So I suppose the thing I'm trying to say is that not every question, if we had 50 different novel food categories, we'd probably still get caught out as time goes on. So I think I'll leave it at that, and hopefully I was heard this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. That was great. We heard you loud and clear, and I see more questions arriving into the Q&A box. So we look forward to hearing the answers. Some really fascinating examples there, and nice overview of the process and the trends that we've seen in Ireland over the last number of years. So I'll hand over now to Danika to start her presentation. Thanks, Danika.
Thanks, Linda. I will just share my screen now. I seem to be just able to share my whole screen. I had this earlier, but let me just. Right, I'll go with the whole screen and bring up the presentation. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. So thank you also to the organizers for this opportunity to present alongside some fantastic speakers. I think it feeds really nicely through now that we've had speakers from the Safety Authority and also from the Regulatory Authority, where I will now be giving an overview of the applicant's perspective of going through the EU novel foods process. We support applicants, as Linda mentioned, through the novel foods process. So what I wanted to do was give an overview of what are the top line considerations, some of the really important things to consider before you start the process, but also what are some of the more detailed and nuanced considerations when you are writing your dossier and going through the process. So I'll start with, before you begin writing your dossier, what are some of these things you need to take into account? Some of the details of preparing a dossier and what are some of the pitfalls or things that people may not pick up on when they're preparing a dossier. I'll then touch on one case study or an example of an opinion that's come out to demonstrate the importance of these different elements. I'll then touch on some other regulatory and scientific considerations that do impact a novel food going through the process, and then finish up with some take-home messages. So before you begin preparing your novel food application, and we've had a really good overview of what that involves, from an applicant's perspective, it's really important to firstly confirm it's novel. It's a complex process. You want to make sure that it is the right process based on your ingredient, based on how it's used, and Pat alluded to the novel food consultation process. Another key point, and both Ermolaos and Pat mentioned the available resources and guides, and on the right hand side I've got the EFSA website, but Pat also did mention the Commission website. And these contain lots of regulations and guidances which can help guide you through the processes. There's the administrative guidance, the scientific considerations. So there's lots of documentation out there, and it's really important to consider all of those. The EFSA guidance can be considered your Bible when you're preparing this application. I'd also really recommend doing a gap analysis at the start. You don't want to get caught out when you've developed your production process, you've generated your batch analyses, and then you realize actually you have to do a study down the line, at which point maybe there's changes to your production process and you need to start again. So considering the whole picture of what you need from the outset is really important to make sure you're going forward the most efficient way. Another point is to consider the latest science that's coming out of EFSA. So both Ermolaos and Pat have mentioned the consideration that should be given to nanoparticles, and I will touch on that, but also having an awareness of the opinions and what is going on at an EFSA level will really help guide you as to what you need to be putting particular emphasis on when you're developing your dossier. And the last point is a really important one, is to be realistic about timings. Generally, when the novel food dossier is being prepared, there's a lot of stakeholders involved. There may be investors, there may be people who have no familiarity with the regulatory process. So being realistic and managing expectations about timelines can be really valuable at the start to avoid having any issues or questions down the line. Ermolaos has presented a form of this from the EFSA side, but this demonstrates the approval process right from the point of submitting the dossier. So it goes through the commission and is passed on to the EFSA safety group for their risk assessment. It goes through the suitability check, the decisions and confidentiality, public consultation before they start their risk assessment, at which point it's passed back to the commission for authorization. At which point you will have your authorization. And we would advise that it would be a minimum of 18 months, but up to 3 years to go through this process. And it really is important to set that out, to kind of have a clear expectation by all parties. I've highlighted a couple of points here that are impacted by the transparency regulation that I'll go through in more detail later on. But this gives an overview from start and submission of that dossier. So for the next section, I'm going to go through this dossier preparation. So the stage before you submit that application through to the Commission's portal. And Ermolaos presented an overview of each of the sections that goes into a dossier. And I'm going to touch on a couple of the key sections where I feel it can be important for an applicant to be aware of some of the nuances about preparing that dossier and the documentation. So I'll go sequentially through some of the key sections, starting with the composition or linked to the identity. It's really important to very clearly characterize your ingredient from the outset. You need to understand what are any of the impurities and the contaminants that may be inherent or process related in order to be able to characterize that ingredient. And that's going to be critical for EFSA to be able to determine the safety and interpret the entire safety narrative that you're going to put together in your dossier. You need 5 batches of data. The guidance does say preferably 5, but I would stress that 5 really is the expectation. And for these 5 batches, you should have these certificates of analysis provided, and they should be done in a third-party lab. And you will need to provide accreditation for those labs and also the method validations if they are not standard methods, if they've had to be adjusted for the food matrix. And these are small points that people only become aware of at the point of submission, and you may be scrabbling around to try and get these documentation. So it's important to have that understanding from the outset that you will need these documents. And if the analyses, they can be done in-house and not at a third party, but you would need a justification as to why that's the case. So having that awareness that you need a good relationship with your labs, you need to understand, they need to understand what is the expectation from their side. And then this was touched on previously, but you do need stability data for the ingredient itself, but also for the final food matrix. And a question we often get is, well, I'm making the ingredient, I'm not making the final food. The issue here is that because the approval is for specific conditions of use, the approval needs to consider any safety considerations the whole way through the process, through to the final food that will be consumed by the individual. I'll next go through the production process. So it's obviously understood you'll need to provide the production process through to EFSA, but you really need a very detailed overview. You will need to provide times, temperatures, a detailed flow chart, including the CCPs, the critical control points. You will need to be able to refer to HACCP certification or equivalent to ensure that the production process is at the meeting the expectations of safety. And another point that again can often be overlooked is that certificates of analysis are needed for all raw materials that are used in the production process. This is to ensure there's a clear understanding of the standards and the quality of these products. And if there are food enzymes included in the production process, it's a separate regulatory process, but you will need to provide information on the food enzyme application that has been submitted through to EFSA. If an application hasn't been submitted to EFSA, there will be details you need to get from the food enzyme producer to submit as part of your dossier. Moving on to the next section, which is the specification. So this is a similar screenshot that Pat had shown. This is table 2 of the union list, which shows one of the novel foods. It's the first one on the list, but you can see the level of detail that goes into the specification. So as Pat mentioned, anybody can produce or bring to market a product that meets this specification, but these are very detailed specifications. So it is a generic authorization, but there is a possibility to gain a competitive advantage if there are elements to your production process or your final specification that you know your competitors can't meet, that will support you beyond the 5-year exclusivity. Another point in the specification is you will go in and you'll propose your specification as part of your dossier, but it will ultimately be decided by EFSA and the Commission as to what is the appropriate level of detail and parameters that will be included, and it will be based on the analytical data that you submit. And as you can see in some of these parameters, it may be presented with a range of levels as opposed to not more than or not less than. Again, this is due to the generic authorization that it needs to be clearly defined what is this ingredient, so that anybody who can market it thereafter is abiding by the same safety principles that EFSA has taken into account. So I mentioned just now about the potential competitive advantage by having a more detailed specification. So this is another one of the human milk oligosaccharides, 2-fucosyl-lactose. And as you can see, there's 3 different authorizations for this ingredient, each based on individual specifications. So because the specification was written in such a way that no one else could meet it, these were due to the different source materials, as you can see here, subsequent applicants needed to obtain their own authorization. So it is a consideration when you're putting the investment and the time that goes into an EFSA novel food authorization to protect your investment long term. And Pat has touched on this about the 5-year exclusivity, but you can see here some examples of where within the specification there is an exclusivity clause that no one else can market the ingredient for a period of 5 years. And this is based on proprietary data. So this is data that has been generated by the applicant, that EFSA could not have concluded their safety without that data. So this obtains 5 years where nobody else can market the ingredient meeting that specification. The next section I'll move on to is the proposed uses and anticipated intakes. Now, this is a section that can really be quite involved with different individuals or different groups within an organization, because you have the marketing groups who have fantastic ideas about where this ingredient could be used in the future. But you also have your final consumers, and at this stage you aren't marketing this ingredient, you may not know who your consumers are, so it can be a challenging section to get right, to make sure that the final conditions of use are useful in the long term when you're bringing this product to market. And one of the key elements to this is determining what is your target dose. What is the dose that can be considered safe in food and beverage uses? And using the safety data, I'm assuming here, this is a very simplistic example, but I'm assuming here there will be a no observed adverse effect level from the safety data. You need to take into account the margin of safety, and that will give you your target dose, the dose that can be added safely to food and beverages, and also food supplements, if that's relevant, that you should be working towards, that you need to consider when you are adding your ingredient to various different foods, that the final conditions of use won't exceed this target dose, because without that, it's not possible to conclude that it is safe under the proposed conditions of use. And to do that, you need to consider all of the different population groups in Europe, because obviously this is an EU-wide approval, and it should consider all age groups, and that can present challenges. For example, toddlers will have a higher intake on a body weight basis than other population groups, but EFSA does have tools available. The FAME and the Dietex tool are the currently used databases or resources that can be used, and it's a case of inputting your information into those databases to determine, okay, what does this look like if I add this ingredient to all of these foods? What is my safety or my anticipated intake data? One of the challenges is these are freely available tools, but it's the interpretation of these. You want to make sure that you're considering all of the nuances. Have you considered all of the potential applications of your ingredient? It can be useful to look at broader categories to give you more market, commercialization possibility down the road. So it can be a balance between the toxicological side, the safety side, and also what potential customers want. Another consideration here, which differs to, for example, the GRAS process, is that food supplements will be included within your novel food dossier. In the GRAS process, in the US process, they go through a different pathway. And it's important to also consider cumulative intakes if there is potentially background sources of any of the components that you're looking at within your ingredient. I'll then touch on the safety data. So Ermolaos presented the tiered approach, but a question that we often get is, are toxicology studies required? And particularly given the current interest in alternative proteins, people don't want to do these studies for many different reasons, and it's not a new issue. Nobody ever really wanted to do these studies, but they were necessary. They always have been necessary to demonstrate the safety. And I've given some examples of where there are possibilities to avoid the tiered toxicological studies. For example, where there is history of use of the ingredient, where you can demonstrate that equivalent levels have been consumed historically. You can look at data from the literature, and within both of those elements, you want to consider the composition of your ingredient. So what are the key constituents within your ingredient, or what are any of the production process constituents, what's been developed, or what may be generated within the production process, which you may need to look at the safety data to see, can you support safety under the proposed conditions of use? Failing that, we do have, as has been shown previously, a tiered approach which should be taken when looking at the safety of a novel food. Again, similarly to the compositional data, it's really important that you have a good relationship with the labs that you're working with. The lab should be GLP, and any of the studies should be OECD level or equivalent, so that those studies can stand up to the scrutiny that they will be put under. So again, really understanding the data that's going into the dossier is critical. So I'll really briefly touch on a case study or an example. As I mentioned, it's really important to be aware of what is the current thinking from EFSA. So this has been touched on by Ermolaos, but looking at the scientific outputs by EFSA, and in particular, I'm going to touch on a negative opinion that came out. You can probably learn twice as much from a negative opinion as you can from a positive. In terms of where are EFSA looking, what is really critical for them, so that you can take that into account when you're developing your safety justification and narrative. So this is an opinion that was in 2021 of Wolffia globosa powder. And this is a botanical ingredient, and there was lots of different elements to this opinion. But on the right-hand side, we have the conclusion of the panel was that the increase in the intake of manganese from the novel food versus the background diet was a safety concern. And this was looking at the current intakes of manganese versus those that would come from the novel food. Now, of note, there's no tolerable upper intake level. So the safety was based purely on an increase versus background diet of this individual component. There were other elements to the opinion, for example, potential allergenicity, but as Ermolaos suggested, this wouldn't be enough for a negative opinion. That will be dealt with at the risk management stage. But it's important to consider all of the elements. In addition, there was significant effects seen at the high dose. So EFSA considered the mid dose of the tox study was considered appropriate for the NOEL. So by reviewing the EFSA opinions, you can really glean a lot of information as to what are the critical points, what are the bits that you really need to be aware of. And particularly with the alternative proteins, these are complex ingredients, there's lots of different components. It's not a highly pure human milk oligosaccharide. There are lots of different minerals in particular, but lots of different elements to be considered. So when you're developing your safety narrative, you need to consider the whole picture. I then want to touch on, I mentioned briefly the transparency regulation. I'm going to touch on two specific areas. The first is this transparency regulation, which came into force on the 27th of March 2021. This is a regulation which seeks to increase the transparency of the risk assessment process. And some of the key elements are listed on this slide, but increasing the independence of scientific studies, strengthening the governance of scientific cooperation, and developing comprehensive and effective risk communication. And in this slide, I've gone through the key steps of where this transparency regulation is coming into effect and where it is impacting the novel foods process. And from the perspective of an applicant, the key points where you need to be aware of this regulation and its implications. So firstly, there is now the generation of a pre-application ID, which is done before you even generate your or you submit your dossier. This is a way to obtain pre-submission advice from EFSA, and it also critically, on the second step, allows you to notify studies. So any study which goes into the dossier which is relevant for examining the properties or also the safety of the ingredient is considered a safe study, and it needs to be notified before it starts. The idea behind this is to make sure that applicants aren't hiding any results that they don't like the outcome of. So by notifying them before they start, EFSA will be aware of them, and they will expect to see them as part of the application. And this point is really, I can't stress how important this is. We've seen, I think it's 15 terminations of applications since it came into force because studies hadn't been notified properly. So EFSA won't accept a justification that the applicant wasn't aware that this was a study, or there was any ambiguity about whether it should be notified. There are a lot of trainings that they've done since this time, but failure to meet this requirement results in a termination and 6-month delay, after which point you could submit the same studies, but this is the challenge for not notifying correctly. If we then move on to the next step, which is the submission of the dossier. So an electronic submission tool isn't new for novel foods. It had been introduced a few years before the transparency regulation. It is new for other regulated products where they would have been submitted by transfer tool or CD. But a non-confidential and a confidential version needs to be submitted for every document. So annexes, everything needs to be submitted as part of this. And there will be a public consultation of the application for 3 weeks before EFSA starts its risk assessment. And the aim here is to allow EFSA to obtain all information which may not have been submitted as part of the application, which is unusual, but it can happen. So these are some of the key elements to the transparency regulation that need to be taken into account. So becoming familiar with that regulation and its implications are really important. And then I'll touch on the nanoparticles again very briefly. It has been mentioned previously, but originally an engineered nanomaterial would have been or is considered something that has been specifically generated for that purpose. Whereas in light of recent concerns, EFSA has launched a technical guidance for regulated food and feed products where nanoparticles may have been generated during the production process. There's a flowchart here which is taken from the EFSA guidance, and some of the key elements to examining whether this is of concern are looking at the solubility, the dissolution rate, and also the particle size distribution and size. And following this chart will advise whether your material will contain nanoparticles and whether you need to assess it appropriately, or if not, whether you can follow the normal sectoral guidance, so the novel food guidance. And it's important to understand this from the outset because there are adjustments that need to be made in a toxicology study in some of the specific studies to account for potential nano effects that can't be picked up in the standard battery of tests. So to finish up, obviously I've gone through the challenges that can come with the novel food processes and the points to be aware of, but it is really important to mention that an EFSA opinion is extremely valuable worldwide. I have a screenshot here of a recent opinion whereby the panel states in their opinion they consider that the novel food is safe at the proposed uses and use levels, and that statement holds a lot of weight globally. A lot of third-party countries, the authorities will look to see if there is an EFSA opinion and they'll take that into account. For example, in China, they like to see 2 other approvals and an EFSA opinion will account towards that. And we have had companies have come to us to obtain an EFSA opinion purely for the this statement, the EU isn't actually a market of interest, but they know the weight of this opinion worldwide. In addition, the information that you will generate that I've gone through is really valuable and will be used in other applications globally. So on this slide, I've shown the sections of an EU novel food dossier and that of a US grass dossier. And you can see that this information that you've generated can be plugged into the grass dossier. The requirements in most of the regions aren't as stringent as that in the EU. So by generating your gold standard information, then you have that data available for preparing dossiers in other regions. So my final points are that the novel food process is complex. So proper preparation is essential considering all of the regulatory requirements and the latest science. Utilize all of the available resources. Both Ermolaos and Pat have touched on these. There's lots of data available, so utilize them, and they will put you in the best position for understanding where you stand and what you need to generate, as well as those previous opinions. Be realistic with timelines. I can't stress this enough. From working with lots of different companies, this really can be the biggest challenge. So setting out those timelines and the line in the sand as to when is realistic, as to when you can bring this to market is critical to avoid headaches down the road. But ultimately, a positive opinion holds a lot of weight globally, and the data that you generate for your application will be utilized. It doesn't stop with the EU situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danika. That's great. Thank you so much for the three excellent presentations that are really informative. Lots of overlap but complementing each other and giving us different perspectives, I suppose, on the whole area of approval for novel foods and some of the trends we've seen. We've quite a number of questions in the Q&A box, so I'm going to go back to the start of that. And I think the first few questions are for Ermolaos. So Deirdre has asked, in the novel food approval, do you approve the use for one company only or the entire food? For example, in insects as rearing and processing, conditions are assessed as part of the risk assessment. How do you ensure another business doesn't use the same insect but in a different way?
Thank you a lot for the question. I think it has been more or less replied through the other two presentations, but quickly, the novel food authorizations are generic, meaning that every company who wants to place this novel food in the market, they can do so, provided that they meet the specification parameters set in the regarding this novel food. However, as it was mentioned before, in some cases there are I believe that the market has a 5-year exclusivity in case the data protection is granted to this company.
Okay,
and of course, during these 5 years, nothing prevents another company to do their own dossier and start the assessment. But this is already foreseen by the new novel food regulation.
Okay, thank you, Ermolaos. So if they are providing, they are following the same, I suppose, specifications laid out in the opinion, they can put the same product on the market. Okay, that makes sense. The next question is about toxicity testing. So is this done by the producer or is assessment based on information available in the literature at present?
So I think also this was somehow touched during the other presentations. At EFSA, we asked the applicants to provide the full body of evidence. This can include the data also from the literature. Of course, they have to explain to EFSA how what has been tested in the literature, like in a study available in the literature, is representative of the novel food. But it's not always the case that the literature data can cover the toxicity testing of the novel food. So in these cases, we ask the applicant to perform these toxicity studies and send to EFSA the available documentation. And of course, the studies has to be done according to some standards by specific laboratories who are accredited to do this work. And depending on the outcome of these studies, further studies may be requested to be provided by the applicant.
Okay, great, thank you. And a question from Teagasc. Thank you for the great presentation, Ermolaos. On legislation, challenges, allergenicity, and the other topics you mentioned, are you referring only to 100% edible insect proteins or to mixed sources of proteins where insects can be a part of the total protein powder? For example, a meal made up from 50% pea and 50% insect protein.
When we assess the safety of a novel food, we focus, let's say, on what is novel. So if an applicant wants to market an insect powder, we assess the insect powder itself, and it's up to them later to decide if this powder is going to be incorporated with, I don't know, with some other ingredients to formulate another product. However, we have also cases in which we have a mixture of proteins. For example, we had recently the panel adopted an opinion on protein from barley and protein from rice. So two different proteins, but the regulators decided, the managers decided that this is novel food, both of the proteins in the mixture. So we assessed the whole mixture as novel food. Also, we had another case about protein from fermented pea and fermented rice, and again we had assessed the mixture as a novel food. So depends on what is mixed. We do according to the assessment, and it's up to the risk managers to decide what is the novel food, as Pat explained in his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. This question, I am not sure. I think it might be for Pat. What challenges do you think the Windsor framework will bring to novel food regulation in the single market?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I don't think I'm qualified to talk about the Windsor framework. I believe it's a very complex agreement. What I would say, though, and we have examples of this already, is Brexit in general and the possible regulatory divergence, I suppose, will have an impact for sure. For example, the UK FSA are busy examining and assessing thousands actually of CBD products, but they're allowing those CBD products on the market while they assess them. In Europe, they're not allowed specifically. You can't have an unauthorized novel food on the market as such.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'm not sure any of us are qualified to comment on the implications of the Windsor framework. Can non-authorized novel food be imported into the EU for testing purposes?
Yeah, that's probably me again. Actually, we had a recent query on that, and in fact, if I hadn't been so flustered during my presentation, I had put a piece of red text into one of the slides. We checked this out some years back for GM foods, and we've had reason to check it out for novel foods as well. So in terms of unauthorized novel foods, they cannot be placed on the market. However, and we did talk to the Commission about this, a food business or an individual can bring novel food, unauthorized novel food, into a country, a European country, as long as it doesn't change ownership and is re-exported to a non-EU country for whatever purposes. The thing to be careful of is that different member states might have other requirements or criteria for that. So in Ireland, we wouldn't be too bothered in general, but then again, there might be certain foods or circumstances where we would have issues. So it's, while the general premise is, as long as it's not going on the market, the European market, you can have unauthorized novel food in your jurisdiction, but one needs to check with the individual member states to make sure there are not other regulations or criteria that are in play.
Okay, thanks, Pat. A question from Joe to say, could Pat elaborate on the change in thinking he talked about re HPP approval?
Yeah, so high pressure pasteurization was authorized as a novel process, should we say. Well, it was a fruit juice in, I think it was 2002. But soon after that, at the working group meetings, the question was asked, did we really need to do that? Because there was no change in the actual fruit juice other than a reduction in the microbial level, which is a positive reduction. You could argue it's a significant change in the level of undesirable substances, but it's positive and beneficial change. So the decision was, and I think most member states agreed, that such a process, again, unless there was a change in the composition, the nutritional value, or the level of undesirable substances, wouldn't constitute a novel food. So it's a case-by-case basis, but all the other processes that I put on that slide, the question hasn't been asked for those. If somebody wants to do high-pressure pasteurization on some other foods, I think the question they would have to ask, does it change the composition, nutritional value, or level of undesirable substances? It wouldn't automatically be considered novel food.
Okay, great, thank you. And a question on the back flour remedies you mentioned, are they now classed as novel foods?
Not sure if I say if they're on the market, they're novel foods because the flowers and the plants that are supposedly used in there don't have a history of consumption before 1997. Having said that, if there's nothing in there but water, then you run foul of the FIC labeling regulation, which says you cannot mislead the consumer. So if you're not cut by one, you'll be cut by the other.
Thank you. And now another question might have been answered already, but maybe just to confirm, can the product be placed on the market during the period it is being assessed, or must it receive final approval first?
Yeah, I think we've answered that. So it has to be on the market, or sorry, it cannot be on the market during the process. It has to be authorized first.
Perfect, thank you. Then a question for, I think this might be for Danika. Is a starter culture in a different type of food a novel food or a new ingredient?
So I'm guessing this is a starter culture for fermentation, so it would be a raw material. So it wouldn't be necessarily a food in and of itself. Then the question becomes, by changing the starter culture, are you changing the composition of the final ingredient? Because then it could fall within the remit of a new product. And that's for an authorized product. If you were submitting this through the EFSA process and you made changes, you will be expected to submit new data to show that it's compositionally similar, that this new starter culture wouldn't impact that final product.
Great, thank you. Danika, now we have another question on how many Irish-based companies applied for novel food approval. I don't know if anyone has the answer to that, but
I can speak as well. Been in there for a long time. Under the old system, there would have been a few, not very many in the overall context, and under the new regulation, most of the companies that I see are either European, as in mainland Europe, or from outside of Europe. I don't think there's that many Irish companies get involved in the novel food application business, as far as I'm aware.
Okay. Thanks, Pat.
If I may add, under
Yes.
the new novel food regulation, we have received here in EFSA applications from 3 Irish companies, one on UV treated mushrooms, one on another food ingredient with iron, if I recall well. And those two actually, those 2 opinions have been already adopted. And also we have one ongoing from on cannabidiol from an Irish company.
Okay, thank you, Ermolaos. And now we have a question for all of the panel members. Thank you for some very interesting presentations this morning. As a snapshot in time, how many panel members this morning would be willing to consume an insect or insect-based food still? So
I have done.
You have done, okay.
I have done
Great.
for presentation purposes. I think I was around 7 months pregnant at the time, so I don't know if it was that or, but I don't know if it'd be my go-to. Maybe
Okay.
maybe it's just not there yet.
Yeah, indeed. I'd love to know about consumer acceptance, of these products. That's a big part of. Are either or other 2 panel members willing to answer this question?
I've already tried also.
You did. Okay.
Yes, but I mean, this kind of let's say preferences change from person to person.
Yeah.
They are affected by different factors. But the current studies point out that, especially in the Western world, consumers would more easily consume insects when they are not in a visible form, like when they are in the form of powder. If it's the whole insect, it's more difficult for the biggest part of the Western population to consume it.
Yeah, absolutely. Can imagine that. Pat,
there's no chance in hell that I would put a whole insect into my dish, I have to admit. But if it was even labeled in a product as a powder or whatever as an ingredient, I'd give it a go or a check.
Okay.
We have actually had some complaints in FSAI about insect products on the market, and they were a bit stunned when we said that's fine, they're authorized, they're labeled, it's okay. So yeah, again, market success will be interesting to watch on this.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Okay. Does anyone have a preference, a follow-up question on mealworms or crickets? Or nobody has their insect of choice that they want to share with us? I don't think so. Okay, a question for Danika. Taking into account the costs, resources, and time required up to 3 years, what is the prospect of survival of a startup in the area of insect proteins or novel proteins in general?
It definitely is a consideration. What we would often recommend is that companies generate the data, do what they need to do for the EU, but potentially look at the other markets that have a quicker route to market. So for example, the US process, you can go through at least the self-grass process in a much quicker timeline, and that data can then be used for the EU. That will kind of go along in the background. Focusing on the EU alone, most people will be looking at a kind of a global strategy when they're developing these products. So that would be a key consideration, because yeah, I won't undermine the resources that go into this. So there's ways and means about going around it so that you don't sit there for 3 years and not do anything else. Okay, great. Thank you, Danika. And just to finish off, a suggestion here from Teresa. I recently came across a bottle of magic mushroom kombucha for sale on some website. So perhaps that would make the insights go down a bit easier. On that note, I'd like to excuse me, thank our 3 panelists for their excellent, very informative and interesting presentations. I suppose I have to confess that when we embarked on this, I thought, oh, this is going to be a very dry kind of subject, but you've managed, there's so much regulation around it, but you've all managed to make it really interesting and engaging and informative. So thank you to that, and to everybody who has attended this morning, and those especially who provided input and questions through the Q&A box. So thank you, and I will hand over to Tracy, and she'll just let you know about the